Good morning, 7th graders. We are continuing our read of Refugee, a very compelling book, and we're beginning on page 141, Mahmoud, Izmir, Turkey, 2015, 11 days from home. God help us. That is what we're to ride in, Mahmoud's father said. The boat wasn't a boat, it was a raft. A black inflatable rubber dinghy with an outboard motor on the back. It looked like there was room for 12 people in it. 30 refugees wanted to get on board. They all looked as tired as Mahmoud felt and wore different colored life jackets. They were mostly young men, but there were families too. Women with and without hijabs, other children, some who looked to be about Mahmoud's age. One boy in a Barcelona soccer jersey didn't have a life jacket, but clung instead to a blown-up rubber inner tube. A few of the other refugees had backpacks and plastic bags full of clothes, but most of them, like Mahmoud's family, carried whatever they owned in their pockets. Let's go, one of the smugglers said. 250,000 Syrian pounds or 1,000 euros per person. Children pay full price, including babies, he told Mahmoud's father. There were 2 more Turks in tracksuits like the ones who had turned them away from the mall, and they stood apart, staring at the refugees like they were something disgusting that had just washed up on the beach. Their scowls made Mahmoud want to disappear again. Dad handed out their life jackets and they put them on. Mom stared out at the black dinghy bobbing in the gray-black Mediterranean seawater. She grabbed her husband's arm. What are we doing? Yusuf, is this the right decision? We have to get to Europe, he said. What choice do we have? God will guide us. Mahmoud watched as his father pushed the cash they'd saved into the hands of one of the smugglers, and Mahmoud and his family followed his dad to the dinghy, and they climbed on board. Walid and his mother sat down in the bottom of the dinghy, his mother holding Hannah tight in her arms. Mahmoud and his father sat on one of the inflated rubber edges, their backs to the sea. Mahmoud was already cold, and the wind off the waves made him shiver. A big bearded man wearing a plaid shirt and a bulky blue life jacket sat down right next to Mahmoud, almost squeezing Mahmoud right off the edge. Mahmoud stood a little closer to his father, but the big man next to him just settled into the extra space. How long will we be on the boat? Mahmoud asked his dad. Just a few hours, I think. It was hard to tell on the phone. Mahmoud nodded. The phones and chargers were safely sealed away in plastic bags in his parents' pockets, just in case they got wet. Mahmoud knew because he'd been the one who dug through the trash for the resealable zipper bags. We don't have to get all the way to the Greek mainland, Dad said, just the Greek island of Lesbos, about 100 kilometers away. Then we're officially in Europe, and we can take a ferry from there to Athens. When the smugglers had packed the dinghy full of refugees, they pushed it out to sea. None of the smugglers came with them. If the refugees were going to get to Lesbos, they were going to have to do it themselves. Does anyone know if dinner is served on this cruise? Mahmoud's father asked. And there were a few nervous laughs. The outboard motor roared to life and the refugees cheered and cried. Dad hugged Mahmoud, then reached down to hug Mom, Walid, and Hannah. They were finally doing it. They were finally leaving Turkey for Europe. Mahmoud looked around and wondered. None of this seemed real. He had begun to feel like they were never going to leave. Mahmoud had been so tired he could barely keep his eyes open before, but now the thrum of the motor and the chop of the boat as it hit wave after wave flooded him with adrenaline. He couldn't have slept if he'd wanted to. The lights of Izmir dwindled to glittering dots behind them, and soon they were out in the dark, rough waters of the Mediterranean. Phone screens glowed in the darkness, passengers checking to see if they could tell where they were. The roar of the engine and the whip-blinding sea spray made it impossible to have any kind of conversation. So Mahmoud looked around at the other passengers instead. Most of them kept their heads down and eyes closed, either muttering prayers or trying not to get sick or both. The dinghy began to toss, not just front to back, but side to side in sort of rolling motion, and Mahmoud felt the bile rise in the back of his throat. On the other side of the dinghy, a man shifted quickly to vomit over the side. "Watch out for the Coast Guard," the big man next to Mahmoud shouted over the noise. "Turks will take us back to Turkey, but Greeks will take us to Lesbos." Mahmoud didn't know how anybody could see anything in the dark, cloud-covered night, but it helped his seasickness to look outside instead of inside the boat. It didn't help his growing sense of panic, though. He couldn't see land anymore, just stormy gray waves that were getting taller and narrower, like they were driving a boat through the spiky tent tops at the Kilis refuge camp. More people leaned over the side to throw up, and Mahmoud felt his stomach churn. And then the rain began. It was a hard, cold rain that plastered Mahmoud's hair to his head and soaked him down to his socks. The rain began to collect at the bottom of the dinghy, and soon Mahmoud's mother and the others were sitting in centimeters of shifting water. Mahmoud's muscles began to ache from shivering and holding the same tight position for so long, and he wanted nothing more than to get off this boat. "We should turn back," someone yelled. "No, we can't go back. We can't afford to try again," Mahmoud's father yelled, and a chorus of voices agreed with him. They pushed on through driving rain and roiling seas for what felt like an eternity. It might have been 10 hours or 10 minutes. Mahmoud didn't know. All he knew was that he wanted it to end, and end now. This was worse than Aleppo. Worse than bombs falling and soldiers shooting and drones buzzing overhead. In Aleppo, at least he could run, hide. Here he was at the mercy of nature, an invisible brown speck and an invisible black rubber dinghy in the middle of a great black sea. If it wanted to, the ocean could open its mouth and swallow him, and no one in the whole wide world would ever know he was gone. And then that's exactly what it did. "I see rocks," someone at the front of the dinghy yelled, and there was a loud boom, like a bomb exploding, and Mahmoud went tumbling into the sea. Joseph, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 17 days from home. A strong hand grabbed Joseph by the arm and swung him around. It was a sailor, one of the ship's firemen, and Joseph knew right away he was in trouble. The firemen were big, churlish brutes who were supposed to be on board to put out fires. But lately, they'd been walking the decks, harassing the Jewish passengers. They'd been making trouble ever since the Cubans had told them they couldn't leave the ship. For 3 days, the St. Louis had sat at anchor kilometers from shore. For 3 days, while port officials came and went, the Cuban police who guarded the ladder off the ship told the passengers they couldn't leave today. "Mañana," they said. "Mañana. Tomorrow. Tomorrow." 2 days ago, the SS Orduna, a smaller English passenger line, had arrived and anchored nearby. Joseph guessed it was one of the other 2 ships they'd been racing to Cuba. He and the other passengers had watched as launches went to and from the ship, as the yellow quarantine flag went up and then down. And then the Orduna had lifted anchor and cruised into dock at the pier and let off passengers. Why had they been allowed to dock and not the St. Louis? The St. Louis had gotten there first. Captain Schroeder wasn't around to ask, and the officers and stewards had no answers for the passengers. And then today, the same thing had happened with the French ship, SS Flandre. It arrived, anchored nearby, passed quarantine, docked at the Havana pier, and let off its passengers. Now it was sailing back out to sea. The passengers on the St. Louis had grown more and more restless, cornering sailors on deck and berating their stewards at dinner. Joseph had felt the tension mounting all over the ship, the pandemonium threatening to boil over every time the crew dealt with the passengers. It was as suffocating and oppressive as the 100-degree heat. Apparently, Scheindijk and his Nazi friends had felt the tension too, because that's when the firemen patrols had begun. It was nothing official, Joseph was sure, because the captain hadn't made an announcement. It was just certain members of the crew had taken it upon themselves to police the ship, like they were all back in Germany. For the safety of the Jews, Scheindijk told them, the same way the Gestapo took Jews into protective custody. Another fireman stood beside the one who held Joseph's arm, blocking out the sun, and between them was Otto Scheindijk himself. "Just the boy we were looking for," Scheindijk said. "You are to come with us." "What? Why?" Joseph asked, looking up at the 2 big men around him. Joseph felt guilty. and he was immediately mad at himself for it. Why should he feel guilty? He hadn't done anything wrong. But he remembered feeling this way back home too, whenever he passed a Nazi on the street. In Germany, just being Jewish was a crime, and here too, apparently. Your parents' cabin must be searched, Scheindick said. You have a key? Joseph nodded, even though he didn't want to. These men were adults, and they were Nazis. Once he'd been taught to respect, the other he'd learned to fear. The big fireman still had Joseph's arm, and he pulled him toward the elevator. Joseph couldn't believe he'd let himself be caught. He'd warned his little sister Ruthie to avoid the firemen, who loved to intimidate the children on board, and she'd managed to stay out of their way, but he'd lost himself watching the Flandre sail out of Havana Harbor, his back turned to the promenade, and that's when they'd caught him. Stop right there on page 149. We'll pick up next time on page 150. Thank you so much, 7th graders. Have a really good day and take care of yourselves. Bye.